1963, a soft-spoken Scottish farmer's son arrived at the Indianapolis 500 with something that looked completely wrong for the brickyard. Jim Clark brought a tiny British Lotus to America, with its engine behind the driver instead of in front, sitting low and light where the enormous American roadsters had carried their engines for decades. The men who ruled Indianapolis looked at it and saw a European curiosity, a fragile little Grand Prix car, a toy, something built for twisting European circuits, not the brutal 2.5-mile oval. But they had misunderstood what they were looking at. Clark qualified 5th, led 28 laps, made only one pit stop, while Parnelli Jones made 3, and finished 2nd in Lotus's first Indianapolis 500 attempt. It did not win. It did something more dangerous. It proved the old way could be beaten. And 2 years later, the rear-engined Lotus finally won the Indianapolis 500. This is the story of the Lotus 29. Indianapolis in the early 1960s belonged to a very different kind of racing car. The dominant machines were enormous front-engine roadsters. Their engines mounted ahead of the driver, their long bodies built around the traditions of the brickyard. The Offenhauser 4-cylinder was the established weapon, producing roughly 400 horsepower or more in its most developed forms. The driver sat behind the engine, the rear wheels drove the car, and that arrangement had been winning at Indianapolis for generations. Then, in May 1961, an Australian arrived with a machine that seemed almost absurd beside them. His name was Jack Brabham, a 2-time Formula One world champion from Australia. His car was a tiny Cooper Climax with its engine behind him. It was not the first rear-engine car ever to start an Indianapolis 500. Rear-engine machines had appeared as early as the 1930s, but Brabham's little Cooper was different. It was fast enough to finish 9th on the lead lap, and suddenly the supposedly ridiculous layout had become impossible to ignore. One man paying attention was Dan Gurney. Gurney was not some outsider wandering into American racing. He was an American-born international star who had already established himself in Formula One and understood both sides of the racing world. He saw what the Cooper was doing in the corners. The difference was weight. A smaller car placed its mass closer to the center. Its engine was behind the driver. The front wheels were no longer being asked to carry the weight of a massive engine. The big roadsters had horsepower. The little Cooper had efficiency. And Gurney believed Indianapolis was vulnerable. The establishment saw a curiosity. Gurney saw a blueprint. Colin Chapman was exactly the kind of man Indianapolis traditionalists were unlikely to trust. He had founded Lotus, a British company famous for building lightweight sports and racing cars from modest facilities in England. Chapman did not believe a racing car had to be enormous to be fast. He believed it had to be light. That philosophy had already transformed Formula One. But Indianapolis was different. The speedway demanded 400 miles of high-speed running, and the cars spent most of the race circulating around 4 banked corners and long straights. The brickyard punished weak machinery. Gurney wanted Chapman to see it for himself. After the 1961 race, Gurney urged Chapman toward Indianapolis. Chapman eventually attended the 1962 event, where he saw another rear-engine experiment, Mickey Thompson's car, show what the concept could do. That car was hardly elegant, it was crude, but it was fast enough to make the point. What Chapman did not know was that Indianapolis was about to become one of the biggest opportunities in Lotus history. He returned to Britain and began working with designer Len Terry on a proper Lotus Indy car. The result would be called the Lotus 29, and this time, Chapman intended to combine the lightness of a European racing car with the horsepower needed to survive the brickyard. The Americans had the experience. Lotus would bring the mathematics. There was one problem. Chapman could build a brilliant chassis. He could not build enough engine. The Lotus 29 needed American power. and Gurney had an idea. Ford was preparing to return to major international racing. Gurney helped connect the company with Chapman, and the arrangement became remarkably logical. Ford had money, manufacturing capability, and a suitable V8. Lotus had chassis expertise. Gurney had the Indianapolis knowledge, and Jim Clark was waiting in the wings. The engine was based on Ford's production 4.2-liter V8 architecture, derived from the Fairlane and other passenger car engines, but heavily prepared for competition. Indianapolis Motor Speedway describes the 1963 Lotus as using a production-based 4.2-liter Ford V8. Contemporary accounts put output around 380 horsepower, still below the most powerful Offenhausers, but packed into a much lighter package. Think about what that meant. The Lotus did not need to overpower the American roadsters. It needed to waste less of its power. While the giant roadsters carried huge engines and heavy structures, Chapman was trying to remove everything the car did not absolutely need. It was a crude but effective philosophy. More power was useful. Less weight was useful everywhere. The Lotus was not simply a European car with an American engine. It was a completely different answer to the same problem, and Ford had just given Chapman the missing piece. The driver chosen for the experiment was Jim Clark. Clark had been born in Kilmany, Scotland, and had grown up on a farm. He was not a loud personality. He did not look like the stereotypical hard-charging American oval racer. He was quiet, thin, almost understated. But behind the wheel, Clark was already becoming one of the greatest racing drivers alive. In 1963, he would win the Formula One World Championship with Lotus, taking 7 Grand Prix victories during the season. The Indianapolis assignment came with a completely different challenge. Clark had never raced the 500. He had never raced the Brickyard. And now he was being asked to drive a tiny rear-engined British car around an oval at nearly 150 miles per hour. The team also brought Dan Gurney. 2 Lotus-Ford cars were entered. Clark drove car number 92. Gurney drove number 93. According to Indianapolis records, Clark qualified 5th at 149.750 miles per hour, while Gurney qualified 12th at 149.019 miles per hour. That was already a warning. The little Lotus was not merely surviving, it was starting near the front. The men who dismissed it had no idea that qualifying was only the beginning. The Lotus 29's greatest advantage was something you could not see from the grandstands: weight distribution. On a conventional roadster, the engine sat ahead of the driver, placing a huge mass at the front of the car. On the Lotus, the engine sat behind him. That changed everything. The front wheels had less weight pressing down on them, and the car could be designed around a much more compact structure. Instead of forcing the front tires to carry the car through the corner while the rear tires delivered the power, Lotus could balance the car around the driver and engine as one compact package. That mattered because Indianapolis was not just about straight-line speed. The cars had to carry speed through 4 corners, lap after lap, while their tires endured enormous loads. The Lotus was lighter and more efficient, and it could make its tires work without carrying the same mass as the roadsters. There was another advantage: fuel. A lighter car needed less energy to complete the same distance. That meant fewer fuel stops. In 1963, that advantage became decisive. Indianapolis records show that Clark completed all 200 laps and made only 1 pit stop, while Parnelli Jones, the eventual winner, made 3. That was not an accident. It was the entire philosophy of Lotus playing out over 500 miles. The difference was not simply how fast the car could go. The difference was how much work it needed to finish the race. On May 30th, 1963, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway filled with the noise of the traditional roadsters. Parnelli Jones started on pole in car number 98. Jones was a Californian sprint car star, already one of America's most respected drivers, driving the J.C. Agajanian-owned Watson Offenhauser. He was exactly the kind of driver the Indianapolis establishment trusted. Clark was 5th. Gurney was 12th. The race began with the enormous front-engine cars charging away, but the Lotus was there. Clark quickly established himself as a genuine contender. He would lead 28 laps. Gurney, meanwhile, brought the second Lotus home 7th, also completing all 200 laps. The American roadsters still had the advantage in raw horsepower, but the Lotus had something different: efficiency. And as the race continued, the difference became visible. The warning signs were there. The establishment chose not to pay attention. Then came the controversy. Jones's Watson began leaking oil from an externally mounted oil tank. The seepage became visible on the track, and Clark was close behind. The Indianapolis officials did not black flag Jones. Clark backed off, anticipating that a penalty might come. It never did. The oil seepage eventually stopped, and Jones continued. Clark had the speed to challenge, but the race was no longer entirely in his hands, and the biggest surprise was still waiting. By the final stages, the little British car had accomplished something that mattered more than a trophy. It had become the main opposition to the American roadsters. Clark finished all 200 laps. Jones finished all 200. But Clark averaged 142.752 miles per hour for the race, compared with Jones's 143.137 miles per hour. The final margin was only 33.84 seconds. For Lotus's first Indianapolis 500, that was devastatingly close. The supposedly unsuitable European car had finished second, and it had done so with fewer pit stops. Clark earned $56,238,000. Jones earned $148,513. The money mattered, but the message mattered more. Lotus had arrived at Indianapolis with a concept that had been dismissed as unsuitable and left with proof that it could challenge the best American machinery in the country. Gurney finished 7th. 2 Lotus-Fords had survived the full 500 miles. What the establishment did not know was that the 1963 race had not been the victory, it had been the demonstration. Chapman had learned what the car needed. Ford had learned what Indianapolis demanded. Clark had learned the track, and the next version would be even more dangerous. The most important fact about the Lotus 29 is also the easiest to miss. It did not win the 1963 Indianapolis 500. Parnelli Jones did. The Lotus 29 finished second. That distinction matters because the story was not about a British car magically arriving and destroying America in one afternoon. It was about an idea becoming impossible to kill. In 1964, the rear-engine revolution accelerated. Jim Clark returned with a Lotus and qualified on pole at 158.828 miles per hour, an enormous improvement over his 149.750 mph qualifying speed in 1963. Bobby Marshman qualified second in another Lotus-Ford. For the first time, the front row was entirely rear-engined. The roadsters were being pushed backward. But 1964 delivered a brutal reminder that progress was not free. Clark led early, but excessive tire wear contributed to a suspension failure after 47 laps, ending his race. The traditional Watson Offenhauser, driven by A.J. Foyt, went on to win. That was the last front-engine victory at Indianapolis. What Clark could not have known at the time was that the old order had just won its final Indianapolis 500. The roadster had survived, but only for one more year. By 1965, Chapman had the lessons, Ford had the power, Clark had the experience, and Indianapolis had changed. The rear-engine cars were no longer curiosities. They were the future. The car Clark drove in 1965 was the Lotus 38, an evolution beyond the 29, but the path to that machine had been laid down by the little 1963 Lotus. There was also a crucial human factor. Clark's relationship with Indianapolis had changed completely. In 1963, he had arrived as an outsider. In 1964, he had taken pole. Now, in 1965, he returned, knowing exactly what the speedway demanded. And Lotus had brought a new approach to pit work as well. The Wood brothers, legendary NASCAR mechanics, helped conduct Clark's pit stops. Their highly organized choreography saved precious seconds, while the Lotus's efficiency reduced the number of stops required. The stakes were enormous. Clark was already Formula One world champion. Indianapolis represented another of racing's great prizes. And the Americans had one final advantage. The Brickyard still belonged to them psychologically. Nobody knew how quickly that would disappear. The old roadsters had won the 500 for decades. Now a British driver in a rear-engined Lotus was about to make that entire philosophy obsolete. May 31st, 1965. Jim Clark started second. The Lotus-Ford sat low against the Indianapolis pavement, nothing like the towering roadsters that had dominated the speedway for generations. Then the green flag fell. Clark immediately became part of the fight. He would lead 190 of the 200 laps. The only laps he did not lead came early in the race, when A.J. Foyt briefly moved ahead, and during one of Clark's pit stops. That was not a close call. That was domination. Clark averaged 150.686 miles per hour for the race. The winning speed was faster than Parnelli Jones's qualifying benchmark from only 3 years earlier. And when Clark crossed the finish line, the revolution was complete. A rear-engine car had won the Indianapolis 500 for the first time. The traditional front-engine roadsters were finished as winners at the Brickyard. The last front-engine victory had come in 1964 with A.J. Foyt. From that point forward, the future belonged to the engine behind the driver. That is why the Lotus 29 matters. Not because it was technically the first rear-engine car at Indianapolis. It was not. That claim belongs to no single machine in the simplistic way the title suggests. Rear-engine cars had appeared at the Speedway decades earlier, and Jack Brabham's 1961 Cooper had already demonstrated the potential of the concept. Indianapolis itself acknowledges that the rear-engine revolution began before the Lotus arrived. The Lotus 29 was important because it turned that potential into a serious threat. It was Lotus's first Indianapolis car. It finished second on debut, it led 28 laps, it completed all 200 laps. It required only one pit stop for Clark, while the winner made 3. And it forced Indianapolis to take the rear-engine concept seriously. Then came the Lotus 38. Then the rear-engine cars filled the front rows. Then, by 1969, the entire Indianapolis 500 starting field consisted of rear-engine machines. That is the legacy. The roadsters that had ruled Indianapolis for decades disappeared from the front of the field in only a few seasons. Modern Indy cars, from the cars of the 1970s and 1980s to today's Dallara-built machines, still carry their engines behind the driver. The architecture survived because it worked, and the Lotus 29 helped prove it. There was also a personal cost to the revolution. Jim Clark would win the Indianapolis 500 only once, in 1965. He finished second in 1963, suffered a mechanical failure in 1964, won in 1965, finished second again in 1966, and retired after 35 laps in 1967. His 5 Indianapolis starts produced 1 victory, 3 top 5 finishes, and 1 pole. Clark died in 1968 at Hockenheim during a Formula 2 race. He was only 32. The machine survived him. The philosophy survived him. The Indianapolis Revolution survived him. And that may be the most remarkable part of the story. The men who ruled Indianapolis in 1963 looked at the tiny Lotus and saw a fragile European experiment. They were wrong. They called the rear engine idea a curiosity. Then it became the future. They trusted horsepower, size, and tradition. Lotus trusted weight, balance, and efficiency. The Lotus 29 did not win the 1963 Indianapolis 500, but it did something almost as important. It made the old winners look temporary. Parnelli Jones and his Watson Offenhauser won that afternoon, leading 167 of the 200 laps and taking the biggest prize. But the car everyone remembered was the little British machine that came within 33.84 seconds of beating him. 2 years later, the argument was over. Jim Clark won. The rear-engine car won. And the front-engined Indianapolis Roadster never won the 500 again. The men who laughed at the Lotus had not been watching a curiosity. They had been watching the future arrive. If you enjoyed this story, there are plenty more like it on the channel. Hit subscribe and I will make it worth your time.